All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? Of course, we're old ass fucking millennials, right? The older we get, I think the less active we become. Some people might even call us lazy. Of course, we're lazy fucking millennials, right? But you
Well,
know what?
certainly we're podcasting most of the time. That's kind of the high point of my week. So I would say that we're working pretty hard.
Working hard or hardly working, har har har. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. Oh.
But no, really, right? It's one of those things where, an activity that we could do as elderly millennials to make us more fit and less soy is maybe swimming. Maybe at an adult pool. Have you done this,
Yeah, but
Brian,
not like
before?
kid swimming. Like swimming with a little bit of edge, maybe. Maybe some swimming with
Exactly.
a little bit of like ironic racism.
No, 100%. And you know what? Speaking of things that are ironically racist in adult swimming, Brian, you had the idea of covering William Street cartoons for this week's topical episode of Millennials Are Old. So you know what?
Oh,
Let's get
I've been thinking about this for years.
No, absolutely. So, let's get right fucking into it. But before we get into it, Brian, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Cringe Millennial Moment of the Week.
Cringe generational moment of the week. So,
Woo! Brian, real quick though, I know exactly what you're going to talk about, and I'm so excited.
yeah, I know this will be quite familiar to you and probably to anyone listening. If you're listening to this particular episode, I want to talk about Sam Hyde.
He is a
Our
millennial, born in
purposes, for the
1985.
purposes of this show, who is a millennial and who I would say is incredibly cringe. I feel like that's a little bit more debatable, especially in more recent years. For our purposes, I want to talk about him right now. So I want to give a little crash course on Sam Hyde. And I'm not like the foremost Sam Hyde or MDE expert, but I am a millennial who was into edgy comedy and who was online at the time. So I have an amount of familiarity with MDE, right? Sam Hyde, I guess, did like avant-garde prank stuff. And he did sort of edgy sketch comedy, low budget sketch comedy on YouTube and blew up on 4chan. And it was okay. Some of it was pretty funny for an online guy at the time. He was very much in the mold of Tim and Eric, but even more broadly, kind of in the tradition of like Kids in the Hall. And some of it wasn't that impressive. Some of it was just kind of millennial sketch comedy. Some of it was kind of weird, right? Like some of it took this very, well, in hindsight, it's easy to recognize it. It was kind of meta-fascist, right? I don't just call things I like or things I think are offensive fascist.
Brian, the best way I can describe it as hipster
He's
Nazism or nipsterism.
Yeah, Sam Hyde's most famous bit, the thing that I think he entered my consciousness from was he kind of bullshitted his way onto a TED Talk where he talked about how there was going to be a paradigm shift and by 2070 we're going to live in sort of a tech apocalypse. And it was kind of like the joke was that he was able to say a bunch of buzzwords and get onto a TED Talk and have all these fucking yuppies clap for him while he said nonsense, which is pretty funny. But what he's saying, and I don't know how aware of this he was at the time, what he's describing, he makes jokes about an impending race war, talks about like kind of tech feudalism. He's kind of describing Nick Land's philosophy, right? Again, I don't know how aware of that he was. So Sam Hyde and MDE, Million Dollar Extreme, his sketch group, they eventually, in 2015, 2014, at the height Gamergate, or right at the tail end of Gamergate, the reactionary anti-woman movement in video games, his edgy, vaguely right, not vaguely, in retrospect, not vaguely, his right-wing coded sketch comedy group gets a show on Adult Swim. This is kind of one of the last times that Adult Swim is like very relevant and very in the media. And Sam does this thing that there's this tradition of right-wing people who are pretty clever, who are not your typical conservatives. They're kind of nerdy and they're kind of esoteric. And they're a little clever, but not as clever as they think they are. He goes way too hard in and starts putting all these really intense, like, right-wing memes and hides them into his Adult Swim show. There's like a sonogram star on it and things, and lots of 4chan Paul shit. Like, explicitly that. It's like, classic ironic dog whistling. People get pissed off. This is leading into Trump. So this is pre-Trump 1.0. And MDE, I think, does like 6 shows. And I watched a couple episodes because I like sketch comedy. We've talked about sketch comedy and I'm like, this kind of sucks. There's a lot of sus things in there. There's also a lot of stuff that isn't that funny. There's a few funny sketches that are, again, more in the mold of WKUK or whatever. But he kind of fucks up his shot too. Like, he probably could have transitioned into a relatively mainstream thing. He's basically doing something for the Tim and Eric set, for the live action Adult Swim set that had been growing for a few years. And he fucks it up because he goes too far into, like, pushes his right-wing thing too far. He thinks he's being more subtle and more clever and more subversive than he is. And he basically ruins MDE, ruins his opportunity to transition, which, whatever, like, who cares, because he wasn't that talented to begin with. He has, in recent years, sort of rebranded, right? I know people personally who are currently Sam Hyde fans who don't know anything about MDE, don't really know about the fucking Gamergate era shit or the Paul shit, because he's rebranded as kind of Joe Rogan light. And he still has weird, vague fash stuff in him, but he kind of he gives young men life advice, which, Taylor, you can probably imagine what's already sus about that.
I mean, the thing with Sam Hyde, though, right, is that, talk about giving life advice. Oh, you mean the guy who clearly does steroids and threatens people all the time?
Exactly. And, the last moment, I think, of real edgy relevancy, and I'm not saying that in a good or bad way, I'm just saying it's the last moment that I would say Adult Swim really seemed to have their finger on the pulse of something, even though it ended up being a bad thing. And it's also kind of it does damage to Adult Swim's brand, and it destroys whatever chance Sam Hyde and MDE have of transitioning to a mainstream platform. Because he's an idiot and he can't read the room as good as he thinks he can. So he's kind of backed down from this explicit fascist thing and gone into I'm just helping confuse people, everyone's so alienated. And he's, with a surprising amount of success, managed to somehow escape the specter of being the Gamergate comedy guy, which, whether that was his intention or not, I'm not convinced it's not. Is what he was for a time. It's really an example of an old millennial who really seized onto what I can only describe as the Adult Swim aesthetic. Kind of once it was fully formed, once it was fully fleshed out, a guy with an agenda and with kind of a worldview, a very particular one, seizing onto this very internet-friendly Adult Swim aesthetic and laundering his own weird shit into it once that aesthetic and once that sort of demographic fully congealed. And that's why I wanted to talk about him on this episode, because we are going to talk about really the origin of that Adult Swim aesthetic, the really rough kind of the primordial stew of it, right? That eventually developed into this kind of a marketing empire for millennials.
No, exactly. And the thing about Sam Hyde too is obviously you talked a little bit about his antics, or at least alluded to some of them. Of course, the TEDx talk is probably the most famous one, but also, his, recent boxing career, his quote unquote boxing career. And yeah, I mean, it's YouTube personalities fucking beating each other up. It's not really that entertaining, but I will say his post-fight interview where he threatens to murder Hasan and wear his skin like a suit is pretty funny. I'm going to be honest.
I want to be genuine when we talk about Sam Hyde. I don't want to do this thing where that people are probably aware of where Taylor and I kind of sit politically. We're over 100 episodes in. I'm not going to do this thing where I say he's never been funny, and anyone that thinks he's been funny is lying or they're dumb. He has a little bit of a natural sense of comedy, but not as much as he thinks he does. He's also not as original as he thinks he is. Like I said, a lot of his stuff is kind of not that different from rehashed Mr. Show or WKUK. It's really not.
No, and that's the thing, even though he does, yeah, exactly, he does have some things that I find funny, but his comedy and, comedy style and his artistic style is extremely derivative. I'm just going to be real here.
And it's extremely derivative more than anyone else. Tim Heidecker, who he has decided ruined his life. He truly believes that Tim Heidecker, because he's a left-wing liberal, bullied Adult Swim into canceling his show. That he believes the reason that he is not a famous cable television star is because Tim Heidecker personally hates him because of his woke politics. His whole vibe is biting off Heidecker's style.
Yeah, well, not only that, but also too, like the second that you just get a layer or two deeper underneath his like fucking carapace, it's just like obvious that he's a fascist. Like that's all it is. And
Yeah.
fascism is not very commercially viable, no matter what,
Yeah.
American Eagle is trying to fucking do with those stupid jeans ads. That's the only time I'm ever going to talk about that, by the way.
Steak and Shake, do you know about that?
Oh yeah, make America healthy again. But that's the thing though, is that fascism is just not commercially viable. It just isn't. Like this isn't fucking 1939 Germany. You know what I mean? Like it's just
Well, like,
not. So
in
and
some
also,
ways, you could argue that it is, but it's never going to be commercially viable because capitalism has decided that its goal is to bring in as many people as possible. We have decided decades ago that capitalism is going to use the aesthetics of liberalism and not of fascism to pull people.
and even then, if fascism does become commercially viable, it certainly won't be from somebody as frankly verbose and degenerate as somebody like Sam Hyde. It just won't.
Right, because ultimately the people that like him are, this isn't even a value judgment. It's fucking nerds. It's like millennial coded, yeah, like degenerate nerds that spend too much time online who really shouldn't be fascist.
They used to be communists until Gamergate. Seriously. Like you go on 4chan,
Yeah.
like 15 years ago, they were all like edgy anime communists.
Well, yeah, and that's all. That was, of course, if you go on to a lot of the early anime Marxism stuff, I remember a lot of those people on Something Awful too. But it's Gamergate really. I mean, it brought a lot of them out of the woodwork for one thing, but it also really, for a lot of those people, it drew some lines in the sand. We're going off on a little bit of a tangent, but Taylor, I don't remember if you remember, like in the middle of Gamergate, like in the posting wars of like 2014, there were like liberal Gamergaters. There were people on there that were like, I'm a liberal and a Democrat, and I just hate women. That was still a type of guy you could be, and that kind of doesn't exist anymore.
It absolutely does not fucking exist anymore. That is definitely an archetype of individual that just doesn't exist. In the same way that like a anti-Trump Republican is something that could theoretically exist but doesn't fucking exist, let's be honest.
Very Gen X, I would say.
Very Gen X, yes. 100%. Yeah, the type of guy who had like liberal politics and like voted for fucking John Kerry, but were like, man, my fucking bitch wife.
All these fucking feminazis that hate my freedom of speech, oh, but they're like a total win, yeah.
They're like, I voted for Howard Dean, you know?
Yeah.
But you know, speaking of fascists who hate women but are also incredibly liberal, let's get into some William Street content. Because you know what, Brian? I was looking up William Street because when you mentioned the actual like name of it, I was like, wait, what is this again? And I looked it up and I'm like, oh, I've seen like half of these fucking shows. And I will say, to be very clear here, the shows that you wanted me to watch for the show, I was not the biggest fan of them growing up, to be honest with you. Like I loved C-Lab 2021. That was like the one of these, like the big four that you like wanted me to watch, that I'm like, oh, I watched C-Lab 2021 when I was like in high school or whatever.
Yeah.
But Aqua Teen, I was always kind of iffy on Aqua Teen. I thought it was maybe just a little bit too meta and a little too random. But, and I just watched Space Ghost Coast to Coast for the first time in probably 20 years, like tonight, as like preparation for this. And honestly, Space Ghost, that shit was awesome. I loved it. There's also a couple other ones on here, like of course Robot Chicken. I loved Robot Chicken when I was like in fucking high school. I loved that shit. Squidbillies was awesome. Moral Oral, I watched it and I was like, this is really uncomfortable. And then I learned later it's like, oh, it's supposed to be that way.
I mean, Moral Oral, pretty brilliant, not fun to watch. Just for a little bit of my background with, I loved Adult Swim. It was actually a very big part of my adolescence. I had most of the show's first several seasons on DVD throughout the 2000s and into the early 2010s. There are Adult Swim shows writ large. You know, obviously there's Robot Chicken, there's Aqua Teen Hunger Force, the premier William Street show, and the premier Adult Swim show at this point, probably, right? There's also Venture Brothers, which, well, it's technically William Street production, made by a completely different crew, completely different aesthetic. That early William Street production, really the start of like Cartoon Network original programming and of the Adult Swim brand in a lot of ways. It's like these 5 shows that I've kind of narrowed it down to, which we're not going to talk in depth about every show. It's really not necessary and they're not all that interesting, but it's this cut and paste thing of like either very lazy character designs that don't make sense or like really unloved and kind of borderline forgotten Hanna-Barbera IP that they could use for dirt cheap or free because Cartoon Network doesn't give a fuck about the brands for these characters, and they could just kind of move them around like they're in fucking Photoshop or MS Paint, right? Like click and drag these fucking sprites around and that's the animation. Very lo-fi, at least initially, it's very lo-fi out of necessity, but that kind of becomes the aesthetic, right? It's almost like when you hear like a really lo-fi rock band and it's like, oh, they kind of make that the style. Or like even you hear like an atonal, this is going to sound so pretentious, but when you hear like an atonal like jazz artist, then it's kind of like, oh, they're making this limitation, this style. That's what I think of these core William Street shows, like particularly Space Ghost Coast to Coast and C-Lab 2021 and the very beginning of Adult Swim, which did become a much more refined show as it became a commercial success. So the whole concept, Mike Lazo, head of William Street, and eventually the head of like Adult Swim, kind of like the guy that was allowed to try original programming on Cartoon Network before anyone else, more or less, right? He had said they have this block, this late night block. What they notice is that young adults are watching Cartoon Network. They're like, who the fuck is watching Cartoon Network? It's not kids, because kids are asleep, right? And they kind of figure out, they're like, oh, it's college kids. It's like the oldest millennials. They're watching old 70s cartoons that they saw as kids, and they're like getting stoned, or they're home from partying, or they're about to go to bed, whatever. And Lasso kind of says, what if we make something so weird that every kid that's up channel surfing is going to be channel surfing and see this weird static image on their TV that's so unsettling and so hard to decipher that they're going to have to stay and watch the show? Because it's all set up to gamify Nielsen ratings, which are checked every 15 minutes, at least at the time, right? So we're going to make something that puts a completely bonkers image on the TV screen at least every 5 to 15 minutes that compels the channel surfer who's up at 1 a.m. to stop and watch it. That is literally where Space Ghost Coast to Coast comes from. And that's where the whole Adult Swim style kind of evolves out of.
Yes, it's almost like a fever dream of a cartoon, like especially Space Ghost Coast to Coast to me, because like I was watching it, and just real quick here too, and I know you're going to get into it a little bit, but Space Ghost Coast to Coast is originally based off the Hanna-Barbera character Space Ghost. He is the host of a late night talk show, which I know, Brian, you love like 90s late night talk shows. Like that is, I don't know if hyperfixation is quite the right word, but you do have quite the affinity for it. And of course, obviously, it was a very interesting time in American culture in general, but it's a parody of that. So, and it's really funny. There's other characters like Brack and some of the other ones I'm trying to think at the moment. But either way, it's, cut out Hanna-Barbera characters, just, like Photoshop and very, I guess, quote unquote, lazy animation for lack of a better word. And they're just kind of like ad-libbing jokes throughout these pre-recorded interviews. It's really funny. I think they actually have some pretty good zingers and moments in there. And actually the first episode was with a woman, I can't remember her name at the moment, but she was like a motivational speaker. And I read about her later after I watched it. And apparently she just like completely like destroyed her life after that interview. I don't think it had anything to do with it, but I thought it was very funny. I was like, what the fuck? Did Space Ghost Coast to Coast ruin this woman's life? Yeah, exactly. I definitely really enjoyed Space Ghost Coast to Coast in like the 5 episodes I watched. I thought it was very funny. I thought it aged pretty well considering how theoretically dated it is. I mean, once again, it's a 90s parody talk show of 60s Hanna-Barbera, and not even good Hanna-Barbera, like bad Hanna-Barbera.
Well, they really lucked out. This was really for William Street. The way that this worked out was kind of fortuitous, right? Because they originally are looking at kind of doing this weird avant-garde kind of surreal original programming with more popular Hanna-Barbera characters. And Cartoon Network owns the Hanna-Barbera library. It says like, no, can't do stuff with Scooby-Doo. Can't do stuff with the Flintstones. We might want to use those. These are valuable IPs. And so the William Street guys, who are basically like just out of college, they're literally like sleeping on the studio floor like it's a dorm room, right? They're pretty young and like pretty like fly-by-night guys at this point. And they go like, well, can we use Space Ghost? And they go, yeah, we don't give a shit about Space Ghost. What is lucky about that is Space Ghost is actually like designed by Alex Toth, who is the original creator of the 60s series, who is considered like one of the most brilliant superhero artists of all time. So it kind of worked out that, because if it had been a character that wasn't so iconic looking as Space Ghost, I don't think that the humor would work or that it would be as long lasting, right? Most people watching in the 90s or 2000s don't know Space Ghost as a character, but he's immediately identifiable as a cosmic superhero just when you look at him, right? Space Ghost Coast to Coast also is probably the most anarchic and the most avant-garde that Adult Swim ever gets. I would say it never exceeds that. There's something, again, very free jazz. The score to Space Ghost is by legendary avant-garde jazz guitarist Sonny Sharon. Like, it's really going all in on just making a weird fucking show. It's a lot of improvisation. It's a lot of self-referential humor. It's a lot of weird things like inside jokes that literally only the people in William Street understood that they put into the show just to make it nonsensical. And I would agree with you, Taylor. Watching a lot of William Street this week, which for me was a blast. I love all these shows. It was, as I get older, I find myself a lot of times after work when I'm unwinding, I read a little bit and then I watch old cartoons that a lot of times haven't held up that well, but then I'm an aging millennial and that's just what I do now. With Space Ghost, it's the weirdest. It's the earliest. Theoretically, it would be dated, but it's almost like so aggressively weird that it has not aged. It still feels, to me at least, very daring. It feels very cutting edge. It genuinely feels avant-garde. And I feel like a lot of the later Adult Swim stuff that got popular maybe seems really experimental, but it's actually pretty formulaic. Space Ghost is genuinely like fucking with the medium of like cable television and animation and like IPs. It's kind of doing an insane thing. And it was fantastic.
No, absolutely. I very much enjoyed I think it was 5 episodes of it. Yeah, very, very good. And I agree, definitely aged very well. And, as well, the other one that came out right after that was C-Lab 2021, which was the one I was the most familiar with. And I remember watching this show a lot in high school. I really liked it. That show is based off of the Hanna-Barbera cartoon C-Lab 2020. Which, of course,
Yep.
I don't believe was very highly reviewed either.
Nobody
was the
knows
original
that show.
Space Ghost. And I thought C-Lab 2021 was completely original when I was like younger, because obviously I didn't know cartoon history
Because nobody's heard
back
of
then.
fucking C-Lab 2020.
No, of course. And to be fair, almost nobody knew who the fuck Space Ghost was either, because it was a forgotten Hanna-Barbera fucking cartoon.
Yeah.
But no, I love C-Lab 2021. I did not rewatch this for the series here, but I was just so familiar with it that I have, a lot of memories from it. And I loved that show. I thought it was fucking hilarious. Absolutely funny. And very similar to Space Ghost is that, it's once again this sort of, I guess, throwback once again to like 50s, 60s nostalgic cartoons, but they add more irreverent, more modern, more like Gen X, like elder millennial type humor in it. And it really hit well for me when I was younger. I can tell you that much.
One of the things that sticks out to me about the Williams Speed shows in particular, and all of the early Adult Swim, but you don't really see it so much with, say, Venture Brothers. You don't see it with Home Movies or Robot Chicken. Those are kind of different. The things with these shows, these core Williams Speed shows that are doing this Hanna-Barbera aesthetic, is it is so Gen X. It's like we're plucking these kind of shitty cartoons from the 70s and we're making them really subversive and edgy. And I know that sounds hack now, but like in the 90s and the early 2000s, that was still a pretty fresh take. The thing with C-Lab 2021, everyone in Space Ghost Coast to Coast, people do shitty things and say shitty things. You basically, though, you like Space Ghost, right? You basically like Brack, you like Zorak, and you like Moltar, and it really does evoke the late night talk show feeling of like, these are my guys, and I see them every night. C-Lab 2021, the whole joke is that everyone is a complete degenerate, and they get addicted to heroin, and they're like sexually depraved, and they're constantly hurting each other, and it's done in just this Hanna-Barbera, this clean-cut, forgotten cartoon style. The whole joke, of course, being that C-Lab 2021, the crew from the original C-Lab 2021, over the course of a single year has gotten so demoralized that they've become completely insane. I don't have a lot to say about that show from sort of, I guess, from an artistic standpoint. I do think it's one of the funniest shows of these 4 or 5 shows that I've kind of singled out. I think it has the most rewatch it level just in terms of jokes per minute that land. And it's probably the one that I would show to like a Zoomer. It would be the one that would hit and not feel as deep. Because again, it's kind of like if you like something like Arrested Development or you like fucking Always Sunny, you might like C-Lab 2021, right? If you like these shows that are just kind of about shitty people, like that's kind of what C-Lab is. But again, it's that thing of they plucked this obscure cartoon of these clean-cut, stupid-looking Hanna-Barbera 70s animations, and they just make them, again, the most degenerate characters in the world. Also, just real quick, C-Lab 2021 theme song is beautiful. It is a perfect power pop song, and I wish it was a full song and not like a 25-second snippet.
No, absolutely. I couldn't fucking agree more. And then, I think the next one you want to talk about, I'm going to assume is Harvey Birdman, or do you want to talk about Hawk Teen Hunger Force first?
So the 3 I think that the 3 to hone in on are like Space Ghost, right? C-Lab and Aqua Teen. But Harvey Birdman, it is funny, it is good. By then they kind of figured out the format, right? They figured out what worked about this retro Hanna-Barbera style. It's got the trappings kind of like Space Ghost. Of course, it's another Alex Toth creation. So it's this beautifully designed classic superhero that they put into a surreal situation. But by the time Harvey Birdman Attorney at Law comes out, Cartoon Network has seen the commercial viability of this format, right? So they're like letting them use all their characters. First of all, the animation's a lot cleaner. You'll notice that even though it's still, it's still cut and paste for the aesthetic, you can tell they've been given more money to kind of clean up the animation. Second of all, they can use characters like the Scooby-Doo and Mystery Incorporated. They can use the Flintstones and the Jetsons, So it becomes basically like this affectionate kind of edgy Gen X tribute to all of these Hanna-Barbera characters. I watched a few episodes of this for the show. There's a Sopranos send-up where it's the Flintstones, where, Fred Flintstone is a mobster and Harvey Birdman has to defend him. There's a Scooby-Doo episode where Shaggy and Scooby are on trial for being like druggies because of the way they act, and Harvey Birdman has to defend them. It's a lot less avant-garde, obviously, than Aqua Teen or than Space Ghost. It's a pretty simple concept. It's funny for people to see their favorite cartoon characters acting bad. When I'm saying it out loud, I'm realizing it sounds like that stupid thing of like, oh, it's two things put together, which is like the worst type of comedy. It is a little more than that because it's so affectionate to these cartoons.
Well, you know what, Brian? I do agree that it is cringy, but you know what would be a really good idea is taking something that you loved from your childhood and making it really like edgy and dark and subversive. Like maybe like a Barney, but he's like evil Barney, and there's like, or it's like, the theme song from Barney, but it starts off with like a one-note piano note as like the trailer starts. That really good thing that Millennials did,
and like you see it in like a trailer, and it's like gloomy choir singing like "I love you," and it's like.
Yeah, maybe someday we'll make that and everybody's gonna love it and think we're cool and not cringe.
Just another quick tangent. I know you hate it too. That's such a shitty thing that's in every trailer. When they announced Beetlejuice 2, and I saw it, and I hear this dark, gloomy choir singing the Banana Boat song, and I'm like, come on, man, are we really doing this?
No, I genuinely hate that. Whenever it's a remake or like a reboot, whatever the fuck you want to call it, and they do like, the slow dirge piano play of like a classic theme song, I'm just like, nope, not interested. Not interested. Yeah. I refuse.
Awful.
For me, that is also like instant no every time it happens.
They always do it with this iconic theme song, and it's like, if you have an iconic, catchy theme song, use it. Like,
I would rather hear a Hans Zimmer fucking theme in a trailer at this point, seriously.
Oh, yeah, no, 100%. 100%.
All right, and then we're going to talk about two more shows here. And the next one, I think, is the one that we're probably going to have the most to say on, because this was one I also watched a lot as a kid. But Aqua Teen Hunger Force. Now, once again, I saw the show a good amount as a kid. I'm obviously familiar, and we're going to talk about it, I'm very sure. But the light, bright, fake bomb controversy that happened in 2007, which is one of the dumbest things of all time. By the way, that was something that apparently only happened in Boston, and only dumbass Bostonites, Bostonians would be scared of it.
It's so Bush-era Boston. It's so Bush-era neocon fucking not saying that the Moonanite stickers were a sign of intellectualism, but it's so anti-intellectualist Boston that they saw these lights, right? These lights of these video game looking characters, like, that's clearly a terrorist bomb. What else could it be?
Yeah, so fucking stupid. I remember I was in middle school at the time, and I remember even as like a 14-year-old being like, this is really dumb. And all my teachers were like, that's a bad thing that they did because it could have been easily seen as a bomb. And it's like, no, it couldn't have.
Exactly. Yeah, I had the exact same experience. I also feel like this is the moment where I should talk about a little bit about my Adult Swim origin story now. Adult Swim, huge part of my childhood. I had all these shows on DVD. I also had several seasons of Robot Chicken, of Metalocalypse, all of home movies. Someday I have to do some sort of Venture Brothers project. Not here and not now. It's too much. But the first time I saw Adult Swim, so I had seen Space Ghost Coast to Coast earlier, right? Predates Adult Swim as a thing. It was like a late night bumper thing. My brother liked it, my mom liked it. I was kind of aware that it was this weird thing. I was staying with my brother, who's actually like my half brother. I was staying overnight at his dad's. His dad was babysitting. So he went to bed and I couldn't sleep. I'm watching Cartoon Network and Aqua Teen Hunger Force comes on. And I loved it. I was just like, what the fuck? I'm probably like 9 years old, right? 10 years old. It's like first season of Aqua Teen. And I'm like, what the fuck? What is this? And I go to school, when the weekend's over, and I tell my friends about it. I go, oh, there's this show, and it comes on late at night, and there's no advertisements for it or anything. And it's got a talking fry and a talking, hamburger and a talking shake, and they're all kind of, I don't know what I said, that they were magic, and I was like, yeah, and they fight monsters, whatever. And I said, it doesn't make any sense. And kids at my school thought I was making it up. They thought I was just making up some weird, dumb story. I say this as someone who was a first wave, like I was there when Adult Swim, like before it popped off. When if you describe these shows to people, they'd be like, what are you fucking talking about? Like, are you like R-worded? Like, you know what I mean? So now, in retrospect, and even for a long time now, Space Ghost Coast to Coast has been the best. It's the GOAT. It's the first. Aqua Teen had all of the meta stuff, all of the avant-garde stuff, especially early on of Space Ghost, but it's like they just cranked it up. This most epitomizes Michael Lasso's thing of, I want every frame to be something that if you pass it while you're surfing channels, you have to stop and watch it, just because you're so bewildered by it, right? That courses through every second of Aqua Teen. Actually, I think this show is good for like years. There are several seasons of it that I think are so funny. It really goes in on, it still utilizes certain Hanna-Barbera tropes, but all with original characters. There's tons of great guest stars throughout. You know, you've got David Cross is in the season 1 episode. I think Patton Oswalt as well. There's lots of cool cameos. But because we're talking about like the roots of Adult Swim, I want to talk about the beginning of Aqua Teen Hunger Force, what the name comes from, why the first couple episodes are so different from the rest of the series. So Aqua Teen Hunger Force was never intended to have any sort of premise. It was always supposed to be this free-form avant-garde. It was literally always going to be cranking up the weirdness of Space Ghost. But they couldn't sell it at this point, because this is so early in Cartoon Network's original programming. They could not sell it to Cartoon Network as that. So they lied. They said they're fast food items, but they're also superheroes and detectives, and they fight monsters. Because that's at least a premise, right? And the way that Lasso describes what his vision for Aqua Teen and the rest of the writers was, oh, it's just sort of these guys, and they live together, and they hang out, and things happen to them, and it's very disorienting. But you can't pitch that to a network like a Turner Broadcasting network at this point. So they lie, and they say that it's a comedic superhero detective show. And so when you watch the first episode, the pilot episode of Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Rabbot, that's basically what it is, right? It's still weird, it's still funny, but they're fighting a giant robot that a mad scientist makes. But the first 2 episodes of Aqua Teen kind of are doing like a Hanna-Barbera superhero thing. But pretty immediately, it becomes something much weirder, right? And I think that's what it really takes off when it really, the spark ignites and it gets wildly popular, is it becomes so freeform. And it's just these guys that live together, and sometimes it's horrendously violent, like to the point of being like horror stories. Sometimes it's so weird that it does feel like a fever dream. But something about this, right, especially with people our age, Taylor, with like kind of older millennials, this fucking hit. And I don't think it would hit the same with Gen Xers. I don't think it would hit the same with Zoomers. I think it's still liked in both of those groups by a lot of people. But for people our age, people who went to high school and we went to school, I don't know about you, all of the stoners, all of the nerds, they all fucked with Aqua Teen. Everyone in my school. And towards the end, even the jocks. Aqua Teen was so hip in my... Granted, I went to a school in Surrey, Wisconsin, like a redneck school. But I would go to other cities and like I had kids and other... Everyone fucked with Aqua Teen. And then I got online and everyone fucked with Aqua Teen. Everyone that was my age on the message boards. Something about this premise, fast food that just sort of exists and is mean to each other and gets into surreal situations that if you describe them, it would sound like you were making it up as you went along, right? Like it wasn't a real show. People loved this show. This made Adult Swim like an enterprise unto itself, and it kind of became its own little industry for a few years. Aqua Teen merchandise.
Yes, and on top of that too, it was the first Adult Swim show to actually get a theatrically released movie.
Since you brought it up, movie is great. A lot of people hated the movie, but the movie was exactly what it was supposed to be. So Adult Swim, like all these Williams Studio shows, they're incredibly cheap to make. They're no budget for a company like Turner Broadcasting to churn out. And they basically continued that way even as it becomes incredibly popular. So what the Aqua Teen crew does when they are asked to make a theatrical movie, they make it the exact same as the show. They don't have a bigger budget. They don't have special. They just make a long episode of the show because there's no other way to do this show and have it be funny and have it work. If you make the animation better, if you make it more coherent, if you make it more epic, if you tweak this formula at all, and I think we see this in the later versions of the show, it just doesn't work the same way. And they knew that. So they just made a long episode of the show and they released it to theaters. Both audiences and like their distributors were pissed. But like what else could they have done? What were they going to do? Like a Pixar animated Shake origin story?
Yeah, it's one of those things where if you're going to make a film adaptation, or I should say, yeah, a full-length version of like an episodic TV show, I think the thing that is the worst is when they try to make it completely different than the TV show. It flops like every fucking time. And even then, and this is obviously much less lower on the quality spectrum than Aqua Teen Hunger Force. But, for example, when I was a kid, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was really big, right? Like the fucking
Yeah.
anime and manga, and of course the trading card game and all that. Rest in peace to the guy who created Yu-Gi-Oh! He died drowning or something, trying to save somebody's life.
Friend of the
RIP
pod.
to that dude.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he died maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. I can't remember. It was pretty recent. But the movie came out in 2004, and like critics hated it. They're like, well, I don't know what this fucking thing's about. They're doing all these rules that I don't know about. And it's like, yeah, the movie's not made for you, motherfucker. It's not made for
It's for
Roger
the fan
Ebert.
base. I would say that's the same thing with the actor. People that like kids, young adults like me, like I had the first several seasons of this. I watched them all the time. I mean, this is true of all the Adult Swim shows, but probably especially of Aqua Teen. It kind of was just like I spent a lot of time in my room reading and like online on message boards and like listening to punk bands. Very introverted kid, if you can imagine. And Aqua Teen Hunger Force was kind of just the background hum in my bedroom a lot of the time. Just I had those DVDs playing over and over again. And like I feel like there were a lot of kids I knew that were like that just watched it all the time. And Adult Swim in general, but the reason that's weird if you've never seen the show and if you aren't maybe of the right era to have experienced this. Taylor, we've basically described the premises for all of the shows thus far. I've been able to do it pretty concisely. I want you to explain the premise of Aqua Teen Hunger Force to someone who has no concept of it in the most logical and linear way you can.
And in all honesty, if you're talking to somebody who's like 55 or 60, it sounds like you're being low monkey cheese random. Oh, you need to be high or drunk to understand this type fucking humor,
which
to them.
Which it borders on. It borders on that, but I do think that if you watch it now, it'll seem like monkey cheese bullshit, but it's more postmodern than that, right?
It's very clearly more high effort than that too, by a lot.
Not necessarily in the budget or whatever, but it's the same thing as with Space Ghost. They were constantly thinking, how can we make this weirder? What are the limits of how weird we can get on cable television? Which even when it doesn't work, in retrospect, I think that's pretty admirable. That's kind of awesome. Let me try to describe the premise to this, to someone who has no idea what it is. Sentient fast food items live together, and every episode they have some sort of vague issue they have to solve. Sometimes their computer is getting spam pop-ups, and sometimes there's like killer monster that's like skinning people alive in their attic. But almost never do our protagonists, the sentient fast food, interact with this problem or do anything to resolve it, right? They kind of just ignore it. That's the most common thing, is there's something wrong in their house and they're lazy and they don't do anything about it. Oh, and also,
exactly,
they live in the ghetto. This is a little weird in retrospect. The Williams Show's production team, largely, for the most part, very, like, white. Their audience wasn't necessarily. I think there was a pretty broad cross-section of who watched Adult Swim, but the people making these shows, largely pretty white. But there's also, like, a thing where, like, Aqua Teen is, like, half ironically kind of hip-hop coded. Part of it is, like, a genuine affection for, like, street art and rap music, and part of it's, like, a weird, I hate to say an appropriation of it, but part of it's, like, a half, like, zany white guy meta-textual thing of, like, what street culture looks like. It's strange, and if you hadn't seen the show, it might seem really offensive. And for the most part, with one notable exception, I don't think it is. But that's like a core part of Aqua Teen that you couldn't explain in a description of the premise, right? Is that it's tied kind of to, like, rap music and to, like, graffiti art and things.
Yes, that too. And also, of course, talk about living in the hood or the ghetto or whatever. Of course, we have to talk about their incredibly white trash, very boomer coded, very Karen coded neighbor, Carl, who, to be fair, is actually
Carl's
kind of
awesome.
Justified a lot of the time because they fuck with him all the time. He's really the Squidward of this show in a lot of ways.
No, he is. If Squidward was like a sexual assailant, he would be Carl. So when I had all the Aqua Teen shows on, well, all the Adult Swim shows on DVD, I would make my older brothers watch them because I was like a big TV nerd. And Taylor, you'll remember this. A thing we bonded on early in our friendship was we both had these massive DVD collections. So I'd get all these like things on DVD and I'd tell my brothers, you got to watch this. And I'd have to convince them to watch it. And then they'd like love it. But I'm showing my two older brothers, they're both older than me, Aqua Teen Hunger Force. And because we're brothers and we're dorks, they all go like, oh, Brian is meatwad. And then like my oldest brother Brandon is like mixed, and he'd be like, "Oh, you're like Frylock," and then Brad, just because he's kind of annoying, like, "Oh, it's like we're like the Aqua Teens." And then one time, my brother Brad's girlfriend at the time, who just I don't know, we're just to be honest, we're just kind of mean to her sometimes. She comes in and she goes, "Well, I want to be part of it, you know," and I go like, "Oh, you are part of it. You're like Carl. You bum everyone out when you walk in."
God damn, dude, that
And
is mean. How old were you?
I was probably like 13, 14.
Holy
And
shit, that is the most 13, 14-year-old thing I've ever heard. That
but
rocks, dude.
I
I've
gotta
never
say, my
heard that.
brothers thought it was hilarious. I would not say something like that now, but I got some big laughs.
Holy fuck, dude, that's wild. God damn. I bet she was probably crushed when that happened.
She wasn't mad until she saw Carl in that moment, because she like was
Oh,
dating my brother, and then she watched the show with us, and we were just waiting for Carl to pop up, right? And then she saw Carl, and she was like, "Come on."
oh, that is wild, dude. That is fucking hilarious.
We aren't going to go, obviously, we're not doing a deep dive on any of these shows. It's just about the William Street aesthetic, the kind of Gen X Hanna-Barbera avant-garde thing. But I do want to say Aqua Teen went on for a long fucking time, probably longer than it should have. And part of that's because it was so financially successful.
I believe it's the longest running Adult Swim show technically still on by a lot.
Because like, and I saw bits of the reboot, and it's like, I'm sure there's nothing wrong with it. Part of it's probably just that I'm older now too, but here's the thing. I like all these shows. I remember at the time Aqua Teen was going on like season 10, and I was like, it must be getting a little long in the tooth, you know? Part of that was because I was sick of buying the DVDs every year, right? But Aqua Teen went on for so long, and it's because it cost nothing to make, and it made them so much money. And Taylor, this is what is interesting to me about the William Street thing and Adult Swim as a whole, but really hone in on it with Aqua Teen. What was it about this weird fucking show that it became pretty fucking mainstream in a way that I don't think was ever intended, right?
Honestly, the only other Adult Swim show that I can think of that had that level of, well, actually two of them that had that level of like cultural penetration is Robot Chicken and Rick and Morty, and that's really about it.
Yeah, but the difference with those shows, right, is they're very clearly like, yeah, Robot Chicken's edgy or whatever, but it's celebrating pop culture and toys. Like it's accessible to everyone. Like my dad loves Robot Chicken. Rick and Morty is, not my thing, but it's a sci-fi adventure high concept. Like makes sense that those would hit a broader audience. But like with Aqua Teen, it's almost just like people were like kids, I should say, were like, I guess, ready for something so weird. And I'm sure part of the appeal was that your parents hated it, right? My mom did not, and my mom's a pretty hip lady, She's like the oldest Gen Xer or the youngest boomer. But she's pretty hip, But she did not understand Aqua Teen Hunger Force, man. And I'm sure that made it even funnier to me.
Yeah, just the parents just don't understand. But obviously, your mom's a little bit more hip than the
But she didn't
funny-duddy
understand
types.
Aqua Teen.
No, absolutely. And then
And
before we end this episode, though, too, real quick, I know you still want to talk about Brack, correct? The Brack show a little
I
bit.
have to. Yeah. So we're talking about the Williams kind of Hanna-Barbera here. So I need to end on the Brack show. So Brack is obviously, of course, if you don't know, he is a Space Ghost villain, goes back to the 60s, and he did appear in Space Ghost Coast to Coast. And early on, he was like a villain. He was an antagonist who harassed Space Ghost. But Brack kind of, once Space Ghost Coast to Coast became more developed, they kind of made him like a childlike, not super intelligent, very goofy and naive. I mean, they kind of made him like a stereotype of a disabled person, a little bit, right? Not full on, but a little bit. And people loved him because he's like this goofy, big-hearted, guy who loves everyone. He's like, hey, Space Ghost, hey, Zorak, and everyone hates him. And he gets a spin-off show. This is not the first Space Ghost Coast to Coast spin-off show. There was Cartoon Planet before this, which was like a daytime, kind of like a Space Ghost Coast to Coast, like a William Street show aimed at kids. It did not last long. We're not really talking about that here because it wasn't Adult Swim. But the Brack show is literally they take, on the surface, a Leave It to Beaver 50s sitcom about this kid, and they make Brack the kid in it. This is probably the most epic monkey cheese spork random that these shows get. I know that when we describe them, to say that Space Ghost Coast to Coast or Aqua Teen sound like some monkey cheese bullshit, they're mostly, I think, not. It's weirder than that. It's a little more conceptual. The Brack show is a little monkey cheese. It's literally, you're following around this goofy, vaguely R-worded character, and he's doing stuff like putting mayonnaise in his pants or feeding the goldfish he's babysitting 3 hands and the goldfish dies. Now, like Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, pretty funny. Like, I like these shows. I like this aesthetic. It's a big part of my youth, and it works on me. But this was a show that, well, it definitely had a devoted audience. It had people that liked it. I liked it. I remember people who liked Sea Lab 2021, who liked Space Ghost, who liked Aqua Teen. There's a little bit of weirdness going on there. There was a lot of people that hated the Brack show. They found Brack so annoying. And that's what I remember, is this was like kind of of the 5 core William Street, Hanna-Barbera, let's say it's like Gen X Hanna-Barbera commentary thing, which is what this is all about. People did not like the Brack show. People hated Brack. They hated his voice. They found him unpleasant to look at, which I think made the creators, the guys at William Street, like him even more. Eventually, Brack recorded a cover of Institutionalized by Suicidal Tendencies just a few years ago, which I loved. I thought it was hilarious, but people hated it, right? You know, some people didn't know what Brack was, and they just heard that some new experimental artist did a Suicidal Tendencies cover, and then they put it on with headphones on and hear his voice just caterwauling in their ears. But it's pretty one note. But it is like, oh, what if Brack was in a 50s sitcom? And, you know, then his neighbor is a giant robot. Similar to Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, by this point, they've figured out which parts of this aesthetic make money. And they aren't as interested in, like, pushing the envelope. It's not like Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which is literally supposed to be, like, kind of a free jazz, like, avant-garde vibe. They figured out the things about the William Street aesthetic that people will respond to and that will get steady viewership. And that's a little bit more on the, like, edgy cartoon side. It's a little bit less experimental. Having said that, it is part of this core 5 shows that are, like, this specific style we're talking about, and I felt like we had to mention it.
No, absolutely. And I will say, out of the 5 shows, I don't believe I ever watched the Brack show. I knew of its existence, but I think this was the only one that I had really no familiarity with. Although I did know about Brack and his general characterization, of course, from, you know, Space Ghost to Coast,
Yeah.
and rewatching it as a kid, and then, of course, rewatching it for this subsequent thing. But yeah, I would say also on top of it, it's probably the most, or I say least well-aged thing, because at the same time, obviously, that portrayal of somebody with sort of cognitive or physical disabilities is generally not something we look too kindly on these days.
Well, so there are elements of it that are like that, right? It doesn't go full R word, but it's
okay. So it's not like literally Simple Jack or something like that.
No, it's
quite.
not. It's not, but it's inching towards it. This is the least essential of these shows, right? Like, and I'd say Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law. If you're someone like me who like likes this shit and it works for you, you may as well watch it. But like, the interesting ones really are Space Ghost, Coast to Coast, and Aqua Teen, and then, in my opinion, Sea Lab 2021. Like, those are the 3 that really, I think they found sort of a match for this. And I like Hanna-Barbera cartoons. They're a big part of my early childhood. Love Scooby-Doo. I think there's a fun show. It's kind of lousy, low-budget, kind of exploitative animation style, lots of recycled backgrounds. They find a way to use that in, like, really creative ways, pretty subversive ways for basic cable. Those 3 shows, and especially Space Ghost Coast to Coast and Aqua Teen, I think they do some really bizarre things. The Brack show is like an edgy comedy show. Not even edgy. It's a little monkey cheese, you know? I'll say it.
Oh, absolutely. And then we've been recording for about an hour now, so do we have any final thoughts before we get to our pluggables, Brian?
So this isn't so much a thing as simple as wanting to recommend it. I think with the broader Adult Swim kind of style, again, that includes Robot Chicken, that includes home movies, that includes all this shit, but it really stems from this William Street aesthetic, this low-budget Hanna-Barbera postmodern thing. It has had kind of an outsized influence on comedy. To put it into context for maybe younger people, think about like really extremely meta, removed from the source material shit posting. The thing where it's like the meme becomes so far removed and so like kind of burnt out from its original conceit that it's like absurd. And then you're like tricking normies into seeing it and just thinking they don't get it when there's nothing to get. At its best, these William Street shows, and I'm thinking of course of specifically of like Aqua Teen and Space Ghost here, they were like that on basic cable. They were like that when there was still a monoculture. So one of the funniest things about this to me is imagine in 1997, someone being like tricked somehow by their TV into watching Space Ghost Coast to Coast and the delirium of that. And again, of course, all of this leads to the development of Adult Swim as an enterprise, which leads to, Rick and Morty, but leads to Tim and Eric, awesome show, great job, which is like more than most other things you can think of that were on television at the time, kind of ties in with like our vaporwave thing that's been big for the last 20 years. I think the analog horror thing kind of starts with Adult Swim and even kind of starts with these shows, the way that they're taking this classic nostalgic cartoon style and subverting it and making it kind of unnerving. A lot of things that have become pretty popular, the only place that you could get that on like television, obviously not everyone had the internet, and the internet wasn't then what it is now, was on Adult Swim. It really whet our appetite for this kind of surrealist thing that's become a lot more common now. If you're watching these shows now for the first time, and maybe you'll be like, this is kind of half-assed, or again, maybe it's a little too random, it's a little too like epic, because there's definitely some of that in there. I don't know if I can explain how different it was to, as like an 8 or 9 year old kid, to be up late just because I couldn't sleep one night and then be watching these shows. And then to be aware that there was this weird thing that if I could stay up late enough, if I could stay up and not fall asleep, I would be privy to this bizarre world that was funny and it was a little scary. And I could almost not even tell people about it because they wouldn't understand because I didn't have the words to describe it. Now everything's so atomized that it's a lot easier for people to understand what I mean when I say that. We all have our little niche things. But this was a thing that was just on TV. Like, again, it was on Turner Broadcasting. And it's like this studio, this gang of people, they kind of like worked the system against itself. It's kind of like they were trying to do pranks on basic cable. And it like lit a fire up under their asses and it became this like kind of television empire. But it really did start as a kind of like guys that were just out of college that were kind of doing like art projects and seeing what they could get away with. And I think if you go back, especially if you go back and you watch Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and keep that in mind, things weren't on the internet the way they are now, and you kind of had to see things on TV. Like, imagine what that show being on TV would have felt like at that time. I don't know if I can really explain it to someone who like wasn't watching TV. See, now I'm really sounding like an old millennial. Like, we say that in jest sometimes, but I really do sound like you couldn't even imagine what it was like at the time. But I don't know if you could.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, it's one of those things where, yeah, you talk about the monoculture, right? Like, and the general landscape of television, which television is obviously a completely dying fucking medium. I mean, whatever is left of television at this point is taken up by streaming, and, the random boomers that still own, cable aren't fucking going to be watching Adult Swim or going to be watching cartoons or whatever, right? Even adult animation for the, I guess, respectable phrase of it, but, whatever, it is what it is, right? But, like, the thing is, you talk about monoculture, right? Like, this was definitely a time and frame when, yeah, if you were a, particularly edgy high schooler or obviously young college student, or in the case of Aqua Teen, it finally broke into the mainstream, like, you could watch something that was, still animation and still somewhat, I guess, adolescent coded to a certain extent, but actually had humor that wasn't completely, brain dead and for like very young children. So this in a way was pretty revolutionary in a lot of ways for, mainstream audiences to have this broadcast even at late night, obviously, because this wasn't like being broadcast at like 4 in the afternoon or whatever for the Toonami crowd, right? Yeah, you kind of had to be in the know. This was back in the day when this type of like content was becoming mainstream, but it had to be sort of spread by word of mouth first to a certain extent for people to really know about it, which we don't really have that anymore. A lot of content nowadays is very much just sort of spread into the ether by like advertising executives be like, oh, did you hear about this new thing?
It's thrown into the trough, and the people who it's for find it and they eat it out of the trough.
Exactly. It's spread through, yeah, like fucking TikTok dances or whatever by TikTok teens, or through Instagram Reels, or, Facebook fucking shorts or whatever the fuck. And there'll be like some popular person and being like, oh, I just found out about this new thing, when they're being paid behind their back to fucking advertise this thing. Whereas this really pretty much wasn't. It was just, yeah, shown on TV at like 1 in the fucking morning, and then, stoners would watch it and be like, what the fuck was that? I gotta tell all my friends about it. And that's how it got spread from there.
And some of your friends would get it and some wouldn't, and it just kind of ballooned up from there. The other thing I was thinking about watching these shows is I think it had a pretty immediate effect on the rest of animation that the wider audience wasn't aware of at the time. Thinking about how, for instance, Seth MacFarlane, his career was over until Adult Swim picked up the Family Guy reruns, right? Family Guy got canceled after, I think, 2 seasons, and then they start showing the reruns on Adult Swim, and it goes like awful, right? And then Fox picks up Family Guy, seeing these rerun ratings, and Seth MacFarlane gets way weird weirder. Like, I'm not like a particular fan of that guy. I think his shows are funny sometimes, similar to like Trey Parker. Like, it's like, yeah, he's kind of funny and sometimes he's kind of tiresome. But I think Adult Swim, even though McFarlane talked shit about them in the press, they did show him that there was like money to be made in being as aggressive and confrontationally weird as he could be. And you really saw that in like kind of the later seasons of Family Guy. It kind of seemed like he had just utter contempt for the show and was like, I'm gonna out Adult Swim, Adult Swim.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So I remember watching Family Guy, I think, for the first time on Adult Swim. So that makes a lot of sense. And of course, nowadays, I mean, I don't like Family Guy, and I haven't really liked Family Guy since probably like early high school at the latest, to be honest with you, just because I found their general aesthetic to be pretty tedious after a while. And even with the more extreme stuff, it just got so ugly and mean spirited that even as like a high schooler, I'm like, I don't really know if I like this, to be honest with you.
It gets ugly and mean spirited. So I don't hate Family Guy. Like, there's funny gags in there, and I think there's even some like solid seasons. So my mom loves Family Guy. She's like a real Family Guy head. She has like the first 11 seasons on DVD or something. But it's also like it doesn't look interesting. There's nothing visually compelling going on. I would say that American Dad is like, that's the Seth MacFarlane show that's like really good. It's just closer to this kind of like ambitious, weird metatextual thing that Adult Swim was doing. But even then, I don't think he ever would have done that if he hadn't seen Adult Swim. If he hadn't seen what these weirder, for lack of a word, more underground shows were doing.
No, absolutely. And you know what? We might cover that in a part 2 and part 3 of this William Street series, because I have a lot more to say about some of the later shows in this series, but we will save that for next time. I don't know why I did like a fucking host thing.
We'll come back, because the thing is, for a show about aging millennials, there's not much more that I would say is higher on the mount and bigger, more outsized in its influence for both good and bad than Adult Swim. If you're interested in these particular shows that we talked about, these 5 core Hanna-Barbera-esque shows, I mean, I would say track down a couple episodes of Space Goes Coast to Coast to start with, because it's the best. It is the best. It holds up really well. It's also the weirdest. So if you watch Space Goes Coast to Coast and you love it, you might like Aqua Teen, you might like C-Lab. You might think they're not weird enough if you're really into like the experimental stuff, but you might like them more because they're a little more linear. I think C-Lab is probably joke for joke. Rewatching it the last couple of weeks, probably the funniest in a lot of ways. It is a pretty mean-spirited show, but it's just like, if you like something like Always Sunny in Philadelphia, you'd probably like C-Lab 2021. And then I think like with Aqua Teen, that's like the most important show of all this. It's not as good as Space Goes Coast to Coast, but it is like a more refined version of a lot of the same concepts.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. All right, but yes, so that is our episode on William Street Part 1. So let's get into our pluggables. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And as well, please subscribe to us on both our YouTube and our Spotify channel, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well as always, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father campaign. You know, of course, as always, our good friends Scott, Shaw, and Robert are creating a fantastic series. You know, last time I checked, I believe they're about a quarter to a third of the way through their funding goal. But of course, they need more of our moral and financial support to continue to get their series off the ground. Now, last time I checked on the last episode, Brian, they're still in pre-production, but they basically have everything ready to continue more episodes of Lucifer and the Father. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I have talking a bit with Scott. You know, we touch base and he lets me know things that are going on. So they are moving along in the process. So they're now putting together, you know, everything. They've got most of it in line. They're still working out some things. There's still some things they need to figure out. I'm going to see if Scott wants to come on pretty soon. Imagine he's probably pretty busy right now, but if he wants to come on even maybe for a mini episode, let us know what's going on. I am aware though that they are now, you know, they've had their shooting schedule set for a while now, which we've talked about in the past, and they are moving forward. So they are now, I would say, officially in production. It's how it sounds to me. So please, if you are so inclined, still donate to them. Pretty ambitious concept that they're doing here. These are independent filmmakers who are doing their own thing. We want to help them out. Like I said, they've been good friends to us. They're independent artists doing a pretty impressive sounding thing that they want to pull off and make as good as possible. And we want to help them out. And if you want to help them out, I mean, that would be in keeping with the ethos of our show, right? We always talk about how there isn't a middle class for artists now. There isn't a middle class for filmmakers. It's all Marvel movies or it's like online streaming trash. And, you know, anyone who's trying to be in that middle class of film, of television, we should support. We spend so much time talking about how it's a disappearing, you know, group.
No, exactly, 100%. And of course, our promise to you, the audience, is that if you donate to the campaign, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email, just showing us that you donated, and we will, within reason, about 20, $25, match those donations, because of course we want Scott, Sean, and Robert's dreams to become a reality. And, of
Yeah.
course, we haven't had any updates on them recently, but of course we have to plug the Luigi Mangione Defense Fund. Our good boy Luigi, of course, he is at this point completely innocent of all charges. He didn't do it. They don't have any good fucking evidence against him.
If they had compelling evidence, they would make sure we all knew about it.
100%. They would disseminate that. They would make sure it goes on all the local fucking and international and Facebook news stations at Facebook University. They would make sure that people knew about it. But of course, they don't have any evidence, so they're not actually doing that. But, either way, Luigi needs our moral and financial support to, get him the best possible trial that we can possibly do. Because, even though this current administration doesn't believe in it, every American is entitled, and everybody who's ever prosecuted in America is entitled to due process. And Luigi, just like everybody else, is entitled to due process. So last time I checked, I believe the defense fund was around $1.2, $1.3 million. So it's definitely coming up there quite a bit. It's one of those things where he's got the internet, he's got us, he's got his family, he's got his defense attorneys, pretty much everybody except for the government and certain media outlets are pretty much on his side and backing him.
And that's what they don't like about it. At this point, they know that he's not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They know they don't have anything. They've seen this groundswell of solidarity, of support for him, and this reaffirmation of the rights of the accused. And now they are more convinced than ever that they need to put him in his place, because they need to show all of us that they can do that. So the fact that we all have this support, that we all have this faith in the innocent to get through our legal system, that's what they want to crush. And that's why it's so important to not forget about Luigi, to remember that, that feeling of like this guy's getting fucked over, he's getting railroaded. I know it was like a few months ago now, and it can feel like so much is happening. But the fact that we all turned out for him and that we continue to, that is so frustrating to the shittiest, most evil people in this world. And it's heartening to him. He's been very open about how much everyone's support means to him. So don't feel like you're being like cringe or like you're not doing anything. At the very least, all of us giving him our solidarity and giving him our confidence, it is helping him emotionally and mentally. And he said as much.
No, absolutely. And, if you can't financially, support him, obviously, donating to the campaign or, do whatever, just post about him online, send him a letter. He loves that shit. Or also, at the very, very least, just don't post negatively about him, because we don't need more negativity on this issue. We really don't.
There's also, like, if you're not like a fucking Google healthcare CEO, or you're not fucking like someone in the current administration or whatever the fuck, there's no reason that you should be like going after Luigi. Like, first of all, they don't have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. They got nothing. Again, if they had anything compelling against him, they'd make sure we all knew about it. Second of all, they absolutely violated his rights. They absolutely did that. They know they did that. Third of all, I think they identified him through AI software, which they don't want us to know about.
No, I think there's definitely some credence to that. I'll be fully honest. And then, as we always said, both Brian and I have donated to the campaign. So, of course, we believe in it. And if you do donate to the campaign, we will, within reason, match those donations before this show becomes like fucking Mr. Beast big, which who knows, maybe the fuck it will. Then at that point, we probably won't be able to donate to the campaign as much. But until then, the random 2 or 3 people that might donate because of us, we can, I think, reasonably match those donations. And then,
absolutely. Absolutely.
No, absolutely. And then, speaking of causes that are also worth donating to, we also have a Patreon page. Now, of course, as we've been saying before, we're not going to lock content away. We're not going to, sequester it away for our audiences so that they can't see it. But, you get a couple perks for donating to our Patreon. So, of course, the one that we've been plugging for a long time is our $5 tier, where you get every episode 48 hours early. As I always say, the first 48 hours are the most important. And you're guaranteed 2 to 4 episodes a month. So it's a value of about $1.25 to $2.50. And you know what? I think it's a pretty good deal, if you ask me. Folks, we are the masters of the art of the deal, folks. We actually helped ghostwrite that book from Donald Trump.
And that's why it's so good.
Yeah,
exactly. No, we have our fingers on the pulse. We are pushing straight into the center of the zeitgeist. We are moving the narrative around, and we're coming up with the next big takes that you will need to know for this hot take economy. Okay? You need to be able to listen to our show early, hear all of our opinions, and then you say them to your friends like you came up with them yourselves. It's a great business model for us and for you.
No, abso-fucking-lutely. So yeah, please become a patron of ours today. And then as well, Brian, do you have any pluggables as well?
Yeah, follow the show at Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads, and the Facebook page Millennials Are Old. Instagram and Threads are the quickest way to reach out to me and to the show writ large, I would say. If you want to bother me, if you're mad at me, if you found out about my problematic posting history, you can follow me personally at JLo Biafra on Instagram and Threads, and again at Millennials Are Old Pod. So I just want to say we're 100 episodes in, and we've broadened the format. We're really excited about it. It's going to allow us to get a little bit more into our analysis bag, and we've been able to get a little bit more heady with it and a little bit more conversational. And if you have a subject that, especially something about like aging and the passage of time and how that reflects on media, and you want us to take a shot at it, say that's the best way to get a hold of us. Send us a message on our Instagram account, Millennials Are Old Pod. And we have a long list of stuff we want to do, but I'm curious to see what other things people think of as what's some art, what's some media, what are some sociological phenomenons that you think are specifically tied to like millennials, and how, that you think have had some sort of impact on the present day or have been forgotten. Again, with this new change in format, I think there's a lot more kind of room for weird niche topics. It's not necessarily just reviews. And if anyone has something they'd like to see us touch on, I'm more than happy to hear those ideas.
No, absolutely, yeah. So definitely engage in our social medias as well. And then, talking about engaging in things, Brian, I think we've engaged with William Street for quite a while. So we're going to be old ass millennials. Of course, I had my Adult Swim bit earlier. I'm too old to Adult Swim, Brian. I need to adult sleep. So have a good night, everybody. Sleep tight, and don't ever let anybody tell you that watching cartoons is cringe, because it's actually pretty based.
If you are an Asian millennial, just go for it. Everyone knows that you're watching cartoons as an adult. We tried to break away from it for a few years in the 2010s, but we as a generation, we tried to rebrand, and it's just not going to work for us. You're either watching adult animation or you're watching Marvel movies, or more than likely, if the numbers are correct, you're watching both.
Exactly. Couldn't say it fucking better myself. So have a good night, everybody. Sleep tight, and we'll come back with a great topic for next time.